I'm really grateful to be here. So thank you, Dr. Sudha, and to the President and the Academy. So I work on the ground. I'm a clinical geneticist, and I thought from where Dr. Katoch, with all his experience as an overview of what policies need to be done, I thought I'd speak from the experience of what we do in the clinic setting. So a little bit about where we started off from, about having no standard definition for rare diseases in India. And there has been a lot of debate about this. So we just have estimates. So it's estimated that worldwide there are about 350 million people living with rare diseases, and possibly about a fifth of them in India that are affected. And as was spoken before, there probably isn't a family in India or anywhere else for that matter that can't trace back a relative or an affected individual at some point. Now, although we keep talking about 7,000 different disorders and how could you address all of them in one go, I think the most important thing is that within the commoner or the more prevalent rare disorders, they list to about 400, and a lot of things can be prioritized based on out of the 400 what is common to our societies and specifically to different parts of India. But as you would know, that rare diseases affects every aspect of life, whether it's the primary health, the family unit, education, the overall economy, the work that they can achieve, and of course, science and society in general. So I think we really need to look at this from, it can't be ignored anymore. The WHO at one point had stated that once infant mortality drops to about 30 per 1,000 live births, then these rare diseases and genetic disorders take priority within the society. And we are fast reaching that in most states. So why is it so much of a problem that we haven't identified the numbers of rare diseases, or we don't have registries, or we don't have the prevalence? It's because the person on the ground that actually sees and counsels and treats these patients are the clinical geneticists or the genetic counselors. And we have very few of these people in the country. So in a paper that was recently out, where Professor Alok Bhattacharya was a co-author, there are less than 100 clinical geneticists in India that we know of, and only a handful of trained genetic counselors. So I've just put up a map just to give you a perspective about the numbers of these centers that actually offer full medical genetic services. And there are very few places that have more than one center. Most of these centers are concentrated in big cities, and definitely the tier 2 cities or the smaller districts within that state possibly do not have a reach from many of these genetic centers. What happens, why do we have such few clinical geneticists or trained people? Because till very recently, we had very few centers that offered training. It's now heartening to see that there are at least a dozen centers with different types of courses that are being offered. Till very recently, only SGPGI Lucknow had a DM program for medical genetics. And this was for an extraordinarily long time. And then over the last about 4 years, we've had 3 more programs that have come in. So resource building includes manpower development. And unless we have trained manpower that can do the translation of the results that are generated in the laboratory to each individual family, the implication that it would mean to the family, we will always have this gap about adequate diagnosis for the reasons that Dr. Sudha had highlighted, that you can have different either heterogeneous disorders or you can have heterogeneous phenotypes, and these are extremely important when we're sitting in the clinic setting, so that we don't attribute wrong diagnosis to wrong cohorts and then have altered numbers in the end. We do need, and I would emphasize here, that you can't have the same number of doctors as you would want counselors, and there are extremely poor number of counseling programs in genetics, which should be the emphasis when we are looking at resource building. So what are some of the issues in reaching the majority of our patients in India? So we have a huge population that goes without saying. It constitutes 18% of the world's population. We have the largest number of births worldwide, that's 26 plus million births per year. Health happens to be a state subject. So actually having uniform policies throughout the country become difficult, and especially in areas of lower priority such as rare diseases. When we are communicating with patient families, you need to make them understand something as abstract as what a gene is. And this has to be done in 15 different languages according to the note that we have on the currency, and many, many more thousand dialects. The cost of genetic diagnosis and therapy is still usually borne by patients. Even the middle class and the slightly upper class families that have private insurances still cannot claim it off that because genetics is not included within that. So when it comes to therapy, sustainability becomes extremely difficult in these situations. And seeing that the health budget constitutes less than 2% of the GDP, it's difficult to get to those countries which have an orphan policy or have a policy in place and then implement it successfully. And of course, which Dr. Katoch said, there's no national data on the prevalence of rare diseases individually or as a group. So there was, of course, ICMR pioneered this, and there was a national initiative for creating a registry, and under the aegis of the ICMR, there are centers that have been now funded to start collecting systematic data within their centers or within their hospitals. While this is still hospital-based collection of rare disease data, we know that it will eventually extend to the community, and therefore we'll have some numbers on which we can base further interventions and policies. So we really require a comprehensive way of looking at these things. And unfortunately, at this stage, although policy holders are making all the wise decisions, the clinician on the ground seems to be doing everything, including fundraising, participating in public engagement, trying to get these registries comprehensively filled. And we really lack support manpower at various levels. And if funding agencies could address that at certain stages, it would be really great to make these things more efficient. Now, from the national viewpoint, I thought I would speak a little bit about the type of clinical work that we do. And most of it is aimed at communities that would probably not be able to afford their own therapies in rare diseases. From 2006 onwards, when it was not that popular to be addressing rare diseases, we have been seeing patients at the Center for Human Genetics and all the allied hospitals that we serve because we do outreach clinics. Over the period of time, we have got data from about 28,000 families. This includes all the pedigree data, clinical details, clinical photographs where applicable. And because of so much of data that we have accumulated, we have now been got together and formed an online database, which was a state-of-the-art effort with a small group of software scientists. And we are beginning to use this, and I'm sure it will generate information that will become useful for many, many research-based initiatives. So suddenly along this way came the COVID crisis, and we had to close down all non-emergency services for a period of 2 months. After which, because there are certain things like pregnancies that will not wait or inborn errors that need to be addressed very early on, so we started doing telegenetic clinics. So we were very lucky. It works for us. We use Zoom-based applications, and we've been able to reach out to patients within their own homes. And in the last 6 months, we've seen nearly 500 families with different disorders, including pregnancies and diseases that require a lot of intervention early on in life. So there are ways to go forward even in these constrained circumstances. The interest of our center has been mainly, as Professor Katoch had mentioned, that one of the groups of diseases that gets a lot of attention now is the lysosomal storage disorders. This is a group of about 50 disorders which has an enzyme that is missing in the body. And the effects of this missing enzyme is what causes the morbidity of the disease. So the commonest of this worldwide is Gaucher's disease, and we estimate on a global prevalence that there must be 1 in 40,000 live births. It affects lipid metabolism, and as you can see mentioned under 3, the glucocerebrosidase that needs to be broken down to ceramide and glucose that is not working in the lipid pathway. What does this do to the individual? There is a primary genetic defect with an enzyme deficiency. This causes substrate accumulation, and these are the primary defects. But I think it sets up a whole lot of pathways downstream, some of which are not completely understood mechanistically, which can cause a whole lot of morbidity, which is faced by the patient in the clinic. In addition to this, in India, we have issues about achieving the stipulated therapy. So the standard of care is to replace the enzymes that are missing from the body. And in Gaucher disease, it's acid beta glucosidase, which has been synthesized since 1990 onwards and has finished 30 years of therapy in different countries. Since 2009, we have been able to give some of our patients therapy, and I will talk a little bit about that onwards. The other treatment that has been used in a less frequency is substrate reduction. It can be used individually or in conjunction, where especially where there are missense mutation, where some residual activity of the enzyme is still present. As you can imagine, it's not only a question of replacing back the enzyme exogenously. There are many steps to seeing that the lysozyme, it reaches the lysozyme, which is the target focus of where this activity is required. So I'm not going to go into the details of how this works. So all of you are familiar with it, but mainly affects the side chains that need to be recognized to target it to the lysosomal enzymes. And this is an extremely difficult step, even when synthesis is happening commercially. Now, this is the cohort of patients that we see within the Gaucher spectrum, which is very, very different from the Western or the Israeli population of patients, which have been described in literature. Our children have the severe neuronopathic mutations. They present under 2 years of age. The majority of them have got massive splenohepatomegaly and a whole lot of other things that affect the hematological systems. Out of desperation, and because they come quite late, sometimes we have had to resort to splenectomy, and you can see how this looks, and most of these spleens are completely filled with the typical Gaucher cell, which is lipid-laden macrophages, the site of the problem. And this is not the therapy that you would afford, because it only gets you temporary reprieve. Now, enzyme replacement therapy, which has been around for some time and earliest in Gaucher disease, was still difficult to achieve, mainly because of costs. So just to give you an idea, a 10 kg child would require 30 lakh worth of therapy per year. Whether you approach governmental agencies or you go to charitable bodies, the moment they see this figure on a continuous basis, I think purse strings just close completely. In spite of this, about 180 patients in the country are currently on continuous ERT for various enzyme replaceable disorders, so treatable disorders, out of which only about 20 are being reimbursed by various governmental agencies. 160 patients so far, as of the current count, are still getting it through the charitable access programs of the companies that manufacture and distribute it in India. In our own center, we've had about 42 patients on continuous therapy for the last 10 to 12 years. And I think each of these patients, we've had a struggle on an individual level to get there. This is where we really require a lot of intervention, not only to look at cost-effective alternatives, but also to see that the distribution reaches everybody where therapy is concerned. So this is the outcome of what happens when I've just put a dozen of my patients with Gaucher disease. All of them go to school or college. They're now looking to join professions as adults, and it's extremely gratifying that they become contributing citizens to the community. And that is one of the reasons why we really require to address these issues and think about treating individuals and timely treatment of individuals. So I just thought I would show you some of our ongoing successes. I don't think that's the end of the journey, but there is a long, long journey to still achieve as concerns with therapies with rare diseases concerned. So another group of disorders that we've had to work with is the inborn metabolic disorders. Here, time is of concern. Again, there's an enzyme that's missing in the body, but the effects of this lack of enzyme are seen very early in life. So within the first week of life, a normal-looking child starts presenting with symptoms, and if it's not addressed quite quickly, they start having problems with neurological issues and probably with seizures and permanent handicap. Now, one of the most important things to identify these sets of disorders early is newborn screening, which involves taking a few drops of blood, mostly through a heel prick, onto a filter paper, and at least 60 to 70 disorders could be tested at the same go with great effectivity. Although the ICMR had pioneered in 1995 newborn screening pilot programs, we still do not have a universal program for the country for this purpose. And as you would appreciate, it's not enough that we do not have early diagnosis, because if you treat late, we are not retrieving the phenotype of normality. Recognizing this, we partnered with a company from Bangalore locally to manufacture some of these diets, which are available abroad but exorbitantly expensive, and then you have to pay customs tax when it has to come in. So a small company in Bangalore that makes organic foods partnered with us. The first patient that had classical PKU in our cohort got treated. This is the first graph that I wanted to show you that we did. It was very gratifying to us. We had no approvals of this food product at that point, and the levels started coming down. We had a lot of support from the regulatory bodies. And today we have got food being manufactured for 14 different metabolic disorders. This scheme that CHG offers the intellectual support to the food products that we require to make. And now that our children are going to school, we require something beyond milk powder tins. So what we are making is flour and biscuits, and now trying to manufacture a drink so that they can take it in their dabbas to school. So this is some of our attempts, but this is purely at an individual setting that we have been doing. And it would be really helpful if we could work this on national basis to talk about repurposed foods or affordable foods. And these are at a fraction of the cost that we would get from abroad, and we don't require to pay any customs charges. Now, why do we study very, very rare disorders? So an extremely rare disorder, which I thought I would show, a very debilitating disorder, which we have several of in South India that have been published, and more so in our center. This is a condition which causes heterotopic ossification, and it's called Fibrodisplaced ossificans progressiva, where normally appearing children at birth start having ossification of their ligaments and muscle tissue in addition to bones. And this happens just by itself or in response to trivial injury. And as you can see, there are a number of patients that we have identified who have extreme debilitation of movement and activity, such that they die usually in their 20s and 30s with only their eyelids blinking, but completely normal intelligence. So what did we find out about this disorder? That's caused by mutations in this ACVR1 gene, which is a receptor for activin. And when it is activated aberrantly, it causes the bone morphogenetic pathway to set up. 98% of the world's population is caused by a single mutation. And these mutations, because this knowledge has been exploited to develop monoclonal antibodies and specific therapies targeted to the site, which are still in stage 3 clinical trials and are likely to come through. But again, this movement of trying to fund the research for therapy was by patient groups that had been affected. Why is it important to us? Because these pathways can be exploited for treating commoner disorders such as osteoporosis by causing heightened ossification in the elderly by knowing some of the mechanistic pathways. And this has been our journey right through, where therapies are available and where we have the altered pathway, the morbidity pathway. We're trying to look at what it can cause and how we can address more common disorders such as Parkinson's, such as obesity, and such as osteoporosis in these disorders. That's been the concept of how we have addressed therapy in rare diseases in our center. With training being a requirement nationally, we have tried to invest in training programs right from the onset of when this center was set up. I'm just mentioning some of the clinical programs that we've had, whether it's a fellowship program where we have had 12 doctors trained, all successfully working nationally, whether it's metabolic dietitian training who plans how much diet a patient gets, or even periodic trainings that we have had for various disorders, and a whole semester of clinical training in the MSc programs that we conduct Center. Recently, we've started the PhD program also, and we hope that this will continue with UMEED funding in the future. So this is
Dr. Meenakshi, I hope you will wrap up.
Yes, I have only a couple of minutes more. Yeah. So where it comes to public awareness, as Professor, both the previous speakers have said, we've had a lot of public awareness and groups, and this has been especially active in Karnataka. And with all this awareness, what happened was the first ranks of patients went to court because therapy became mandatory for people who could not work endlessly. And I'm leaving you with a court order, which was very it was a landmark judgment as far as this is the first time the state decided to fund therapy for rare diseases. They've been getting continuous funding from Karnataka state government since 2016 onwards. When you have therapy that you need to give, you need a specialized center that can realize the value of the therapy that's being given and have the expertise to administer it. So we set up the Rare Diseases Center of Excellence at the State Children's Hospital, where these therapies are being administered now, at least 120 infusions a month for PID and for LSDs, and many other centers have copied this model from us. Prenatal diagnosis is available for those families that have chance of recurrence. We are offering all sorts of tests a year. Now, all this work has led us through the national policy draft to be named as one of the 8 centers of excellence through which implementation of these things would happen. But I think that this is all going to be necessary, integral, exactly as Professor Katoch had said initially, that we need to have a very globalized view of how we address this whole thing. And I would end with acknowledgements, mainly first to the Department of IT and BT, Government of Karnataka, because of whom we have been able to offer free services to the poorest class of patients. Dr. Kiran Majumdar-Shaw, I have the honor of being endowed with the Kiran Majumdar-Shaw chair in this center, the Indian Council of Medical Research and the Department of Biotechnology India, who have funded most of our education programs and research projects. Thank you.